the basics of education funding in the state of Arizona. So this is about education funding in the state of Arizona. And I just want to preface by saying this is the basics. This is not, if you need specifics, if you want in-depth, if you want an expert, that's why we have a CFO. So that's where you're going to go to him. This is what we're going to talk about, what the Constitution actually says, the basic formula, who pays for what, funds in the classroom, and then we have some take-home messages for you. So, Cindy already mentioned, the Arizona State Constitution tells the state legislature, you have to fund our schools. It tells them exactly what they have to fund in our schools, how that system should look up, and there's a very specific section, 10, that tells them how they can fund our schools. And there's only 2 ways that it gives them. State land trust and taxation. That's it. So that's why all of this stuff you're hearing is about these 2 ways to fund it. And it kind of makes sense. This is the most important thing, I think, to know about the state of Arizona, because it's really different than a lot of other states. Back in the 1970s, we were caught by the federal government not equitably funding education across our state. And they said, you got to come up with something better because this isn't working. Ours is largely based on property taxes. So the state developed what's known as the equalization funding formula, so that every child in the state of Arizona, no matter where they live, no matter what their zip code is, no matter what their tax base is, receives the exact same amount of funding from the state. That number, that base level funding, is typically what the number that you all hear about when we're compared to other states and ranked, 49th or 50th in the nation. It's that base level funding. That is not all the funding that our students get, because on top of that, we layer other levels of funding. The weights. And I have experts out here, so if I'm saying anything really wrong, you should definitely jump in. So there are all different kinds of weights for all different kinds of things, and weights are calculated differently. Some are multipliers, some are flat amounts of money. And I kind of just put some examples on here. Just of note, we used to have a K-3 weight that was for all-day kindergarten that got taken away, so sometimes weights come and then they go. And the one I want to use just as an example, because I think all of us have had some interaction with special ed, either because it's our own kid, or we have a neighbor, or we have a nephew like I do. It's an interesting one to look at, too, because there's lots of different weights, as it were. So what the state has done is it has taken categories of kids. Kids who are identified with a special need under federal statute get an IEP. The state says, okay, all these kids have this kind of special need. All these kids have this kind of special need. And based on the need, the state has said, okay, then you get a multiplier. So my nephew, for instance, falls in that top category, multiple disabilities, severe sensory impairment. So he gets that base level funding, 3,200, 3,300, wherever we are right now, and it gets multiplied by almost 8, right? So he gets almost, or a little over, $24,000. And there's all these different categories for all these different kiddos. Interestingly, for us, especially in Scottsdale, but, so you look over here, I seriously had to double take, right? I'm like, is this like a real thing? Like 0.003? So this is speech and language impairment, other health impaired. The vast majority of kids in Scottsdale Unified who have an IEP fall into this category. Kids who are lots of times in the typical classroom, but they need some extra assistance to, okay, so take base level funding, $3,300,
80%.
right?
80% of our students fall.
80%. I thought it was like 74. 80% are right here. So $3,200 times 0.003, right? We're at about what?
$96.
No.
Or no, wait.
No.
I just did it. I sent.
9.6.
Sorry.
It's $10 a year extra that the state gives us to educate a child with an IEP. So, I will leave you to decide if that is adequate or not. But the truth is, it's not. But that child still needs to be educated, right? That child still needs to come to school and go to class. And so the rest of the money for that child's education, because under federal statute they have to be educated, and we want them to be educated, has to come from somewhere else. Somewhere. So it's just interesting, and I have never found out exactly who came up with the multipliers or how they came up with the multipliers. Yes?
Has our governor seen this?
Well, this is actually an interesting thing.
That he knows this.
I think that you're probably right, because we did show this to one of our elected officials several years ago, and when we told him specifically about this, he said, well, that can't be right. And I said, well, it's off of the ADE's website, so, it's not right, it's not. And he said, well, that just can't, that's silly. Why would we do that? And I was like, I don't know. So I would venture to guess that you're right. I think lots of things that happen in policy happen, they become entrenched, we don't think about them anymore, and then we just always have to live with the consequences. So, but that gives you an idea of what the multipliers look like, right? And for my nephew, who's up here, you know, he's not really independently ambulatory, and he still has a feed tube some of the day, and he gets speech therapy and occupational therapy and physical therapy, and he's in a classroom with 6 children and 5 aides and a teacher. And so even that, when you start to think about, gosh, is that really covering everything, right? And yet, you know, having my nephew be in there and be socialized and kind of maximize his potential is a much smaller cost to invest in than taking care of him without all that on the end. But anyways, that's what weights can look like. This is the other really important thing to know about funding in the state of Arizona. There are lots of different pots of money that are not interchangeable. I'm sure our school board members in the room are like, yes, it's very frustrating, very annoying. Capital is one of them. So we get money for M&O, right? And think about when we pass overrides, like we pass a, move over here, okay, oh. So we pass an M&O override, right? And then we have to pass a separate capital override. That's because the pots are separated by the state, and the state gives us those monies separately. And Mr. Ryan can tell you lots and lots and lots more. And there's also 2 kinds of capital, right? There's soft capital, the stuff you consume, the pencils, the paper, maybe we don't use that as much. And then sort of the hard capital. It's not called hard capital, there's a big long name for it, but it's like desks and chairs and stuff that's going to last for a while. And high school textbooks all in there. But again, this isn't always funded by the state, right? In the Great Recession, they were like, yeah, no money for soft capital. Like, we don't have that. You can take it from somewhere else. They let us for a little while say, if you have a little extra money, you can scooch it on into M&O if you want. It was a short-term deal. But typically, this is just the most important thing to know as we try to wrap our heads around how does all this happen. Pots of money are really separate in the state of Arizona. And we'll get another example of that here in just a minute. Okay, so we have the base level funding, we have all these weights, we sometimes get some money for capital, and then there's this whole separate thing about buildings and facilities. If you're a growing district, if you're a new district, the state gives you money for your buildings because you're new and you're just starting. Older districts like ours are supposed to get money for maintenance, right? We have an old building, we're supposed to get money to make sure the air conditionings are running and the lights stay on. The problem is that the legislature has to appropriate every year during budgeting money for the school facilities board. They're supposed to say, okay, part of our budget is this amount of money, we give it to the school facilities board, and then schools come forward and say, hey, we need some of that money, we got to fix some stuff. For many years, there was no money, none at all, appropriated for school facilities boards. And then there was a little bit of money. But what happened is, you guys often hear of a structural deficit, we have like a maintenance deficit. For so many years when you don't maintain, I mean, imagine if you did nothing to your house. The plumber never came, the electrician never came, like the landscaper never, nobody ever came to your house for 10 years. You got a big mess at your house, right? And fixing it at that point is kind of a disaster. It would have been a lot easier to put a little bit in over time. That's kind of where we are a lot in a lot of our schools across the state because we just haven't kept up. And by we, I say we the citizenry because we, of course, are the government. We just haven't kept up with the maintenance of these older buildings. That's why a lot of times it is much more efficient for schools, older schools, to go out and bond for a new building. If you have a really, really old building where you can't even retrofit stuff anymore and who knows what's in your walls anymore, it is much more efficient to go to your community and say, let's build a new building, right? We can bond for that, and we have the money for it, we can maintain it, and that's what we have done in our district, right? We rebuilt our high schools, we rebuilt our middle schools. They're much more efficient, and we haven't had to deal with, we have an air conditioner and we can't find a part because they don't make them anymore. So that's just kind of an interesting thing to note about buildings. We'll get a little bit to the difference between bonds and overrides. I am very thankful that we do not have anything on the ballot this year because I have to tell you, I have friends in lots of districts, and what they hear when they knock on people's doors is, oh, you don't need to worry because $3.5 billion is coming your way, so no worries at all if the override doesn't pass. Not understanding, right, that the $3.5 billion, one, isn't here yet, two, is retroactively paying for stuff that hasn't been paid yet, and three, the bonds is still needed even if we got all that money because we're still 50th in the nation. So this is old hat for you guys. You know M&O overrides. We get them every 7 years. In the fifth year they start to decrease, so it's on a 4-year cycle for renewal. And that's really about the M&O budget. Capital overrides, again, is just for that capital. And then bonds, the difference with bonds, and I'll kind of scooch ahead, bonds have to be very specifically tied to a project, right? You can't just say, we want $1 million for bond. We want to sell, go buy or sell $1 million worth of bonds, and then we'll do something with it. You have to tell your constituents what exactly you're going to do with it. And there was a ballot measure a few years ago, because up in Cave Creek, they passed a bond, they were going to build a high school, then they decided, no, we can't build a high school, but they had sold all these bonds, they had all this money, they're like, can we do something else with it? And the law said, no, you can't. So it's just like sitting there. Yeah?
I know it's kind of separate. Do you know, is that the case for the city bond as well? Does anyone know?
Do you know?
It's not.
It's not.
They're different.
Okay.
They're different. So
Right.
they have, so once again, why is it not surprising that schools have special laws just for us, right? That nobody else has to abide by. But that's kind of where they are, and it's really important for you to know. I am amazed. Now, there's 28 ballot measures for schools. How many people confuse overrides and bonds, or call them override bonds, or bond overrides, or, it's very confusing. It's hard to, at some point, not think it's intentionally confusing, because it's really easy to confuse people. So that's the difference between bonds and overrides. So, okay, again, we've got, and then, of course, we have tax credit coming up here very soon. State law allows us to take what we would owe in taxes, spend it directly out of school, and then that gets subtracted directly from our tax bill. Because we pay it directly, I think it's important for you guys to understand this. This is how, when people say, well, how can you take your taxes and go fund like a Catholic school? Because it never was taxes, is the way the state has defined it, and the way the courts have defined it. Because you pay it before you're paying your taxes. It's your money that the state allows you to designate for a private school or a private organization, whatever, and that's how they get around the whole, how can you spend your tax money for a parochial school. But anyways, tax credit, you guys know, $400 for married couple, $200 for single couple. There's always been some talk about sort of opening what we can do with our tax credit, because it's very unlikely we'll get more tax credit from the state to match up with what private schools get, but at least loosening the restrictions so it's beyond just extracurriculars. But just a little plug for that, and I don't know if I have this.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Tax credit. Can you go back to that slide?
The tax credit slide?
Yes.
Right here.
So the second bullet point there.
Yeah.
Not associated with a grade.
Right. So
I
let's
thought it was
say
not during school hours.
no.
It's not associated with a grade. So
Right.
we have some schools, sorry.
No, jump in. This is
mean,
why
you
we
know,
have
a
experts in
field
the
trip.
room.
We have some schools that use it for field trips. We have some schools that use it for a lunchtime PE or wellness fitness program. As long as it's being used in a non-classroom graded activity, it can
Right.
be used 24/7.
Non-academic.
And it can't be mandatory. So like tutoring at lunchtime, I can't say, you have to go to this and we're going to use it for tax credit. I can say, we're using our tax credit for tutoring and we invite you to come. But I can't make you go. Otherwise it doesn't count. But I think tax credit, we kind of need to think about it a little bit differently, especially when we talk to people maybe who don't necessarily have kids and like in high school sports, like that's where a lot of tax credit is used. Because you have to think about it this way, and I love to use sports. My kids all played sports, and I think sports are great, and I think they're an integral part of a well-rounded education. But the truth is that what we charge kids to play sports in our schools is not the cost of the sport in school. And different sports have higher and lower costs, right? So Dr. Peterson once told me, he goes, I said, well, so where does the other money come from? Well, it comes from M&O, right? Because we believe that this is an important part of an education. We believe that this is an important part of programming in our schools. And so we take part of our M&O money, we supplement it with what kids give us, but then the district pays for the rest because it's an important program. If we got enough tax credit money to cover all the costs of the sports that our kids actually play, all that money that we are using to support that programming would stay in M&O. And what's 90% of M&O? Teachers and salaries and benefits. So I think thinking of tax credit a little bit differently helps us understand the real importance of really getting people to give that money. It's kind of a way for us to circumvent, to take a tool that the state has given us and circumvent cuts to education by saying, okay, so we're going to just take it directly out of our taxes, right, and pay for the stuff in our schools. And it doesn't seem like we can pay for it directly in our schools, but we really can. even we in public education. There are some other pots of money, and one has now become incredibly important. There are some adjacent ways. I talked again about how all the pots are separate. So my favorite adjacent ways story is this. You know, some parent comes to school, they're fixing the sidewalk in front of the school, and the parent's like, good God almighty, right? I've got 42 kids in my class, and you guys have money to fix the stupid sidewalk? Well, because that money came out of adjacent ways. And adjacent ways means property that we share with other public entities, the city, right? We can't say we'd much rather. We've talked to the city, and we'd all much rather put the money into our classroom than fix our sidewalk. We're just not allowed to do that. Our poor board members, I can't imagine the things that they hear from people about, like, I can't believe that you decided to. Lots of these decisions are totally not within the purview of the people we think they're within, right? Nobody gets to say, I'm using my adjacent waste money for something else. It just doesn't work that way. There's desegregation money, there's special transportation money sometimes, and we used to have some prevention money, and there's a little bit of Indian gaming money. But one of the ways that we can get extra money is through ballot measures. Like Prop 301. And I never used to talk about this, but I'm going to talk about it right now. So back in 2000, then Governor Jane Hall, who was a former teacher, really, she's like, we got to get more money to the classroom. We have to do something. And really, if you look back in history, her real concern was, we have a serious maintenance deficit. She was really worried that, like, SFB wasn't being funded. She's like, this is going to come back to bite us. We got to do something. And so she proposed a 20-year revenue bond that would pay teachers more based on performance, fund inflation, and there was supposed to be kind of some money in there to help with our buildings. So also very interesting, special session for Proposition 301 was very contentious. There was not a whole bunch of, like, everybody's like, yeah, this sounds great, let's just put that ballot measure forward. There were lots of people who were like, this is stupid, how do we know the money's going to get to the classroom, it's 20 years, it's too long. So it was a very, very contentious special session. Eventually, something was referred to the ballot. And Governor Hall was very smart because she lined up her ducks and she got a whole bunch of businesses to back this up before she ever brought it to the legislature. Because what she told them is this, I'm gonna bring it to the legislature and I'm gonna get beat up over this. But when I get this out, you need to fund the campaign, which is exactly what happened. So we then passed Proposition 301 by 53.7%, I want to say, which is pretty good. You know, if you're not like 49-51, you're thinking like, okay, it's not quite a landslide, but. And the deal was that, you know, that was the deal. There would be money for teachers, and you hear about that all the one 301 money. Teachers have to do this whole big performance thing, show us how you were really successful, and then the state will give you some money. There was supposed to be this 2% inflation every year for 20 years. We all agreed to that. We thought that was a good idea. And then what happened? So this is why we're here right now. So back in 2008, the legislature looked and said, we got no money. We can't pay. And the Arizona School Boards Association went and said, if you don't put that money in the budget, we're going to sue you, because it's the law. You have to do it. And the legislature was like, we got no money. So they passed a budget, and Governor Brewer at the time signed off on it. And it took a couple years, and then sure enough, they got sued. And that's where we are right now. That's exactly what this is about. Back in 2000, we passed a ballot measure. We said we wanted this. The legislature in 2008 said we can't pay. We just can't do it. They got sued. It's been through I don't know how many courtrooms. And so the courts have at this point said, listen, you owe them. You broke the law. And the legislature's like, well, we still don't have the money. So now we're at the point where the courts have said, we can't decide if you owe them all the back money that you owe them, because that's a big piece. That's like $1.3 billion. They can't write that check. They really don't have the money for that. So what the court has said at this point is, if you had paid inflation all the way along, right, the base would be higher, right? It would be compounded 2%. That's where the $331 million comes from. If you had adjusted the base all along from 2008 to 2015, you would owe them $331.69 million, whatever it is, right? That's what the settlement is all about right now. So everything else doesn't really have to do with 301. It has to do with, okay, how are we not going to get in this pickle again? How are we going to have money available to pay 2% inflation? Because we pay this until 2020. The next question is, and then what after 2020? Because after 2020, this is all gone. So, unless the legislature decides to do something, or we bring another ballot measure forward, but this is on your horizon, right? On all of our horizons if we remain in the state of Arizona. And just so you kind of get an idea of like how much money, I mean, you know, it's small, it's like not a huge amount of money that is infused, but still when you think that, you know, the settlement right now is about adding $173 per kid, right? There are points in time where just from 301 money we got $400 per kid. So it can be really good, and it's based on the taxes, like, you know, revenues coming in. So that's why it's kind of important to know, like, this is just another way to infuse money. Another really interesting thing about 301, and this is my cautionary tale to you, should a ballot measure come before you anytime soon, it is super, super important to read the whole thing. I don't know how many of you were around in 2000. I was, and I was just getting involved in education, and I was so excited that I'm like, I am so voting for my teachers to get more money. That is the best thing. And the whole campaign was about that. They didn't really talk about inflation, right? There wasn't anything about that. It was all about, if you want to increase your teacher salaries, vote yes on 301. And I'm like, I'm so voting yes. I'm so voting yes. And I didn't read the proposition all the way, which you always should, because they're always long. It's never one sentence. This was also in Proposition 301. In Proposition 301, buried in there, a little paragraph, there was, and in 2011, if you vote yes on this now, we will sunset excess utilities. Okay, well, if I had read it, I would have probably been like, whatever, sunset excess utilities, I don't care about that. Okay, here's another little story about the state of Arizona. Back in the 1980s, the legislature said, you know what? Utilities are too high for these schools in the state of Arizona. We can't afford that. We're freezing everybody at 1980s levels. But if you're a school and you spend more, you can come back to the state and say, we spent more, can you please reimburse us? That was known as excess utilities. And what it said in Proposition 301, if you want to give your teachers more money, and if you want to pay inflation, if you want to, you're going to have to give up your ability to come back to us for utilities. A lot of you probably know. That was to the tune of $5 million for SUSD alone. So we still keep the lights on, we still keep the air conditioning running, we just have to pay for that out of someplace else, right? And it's all out of M&O. The someplace else is always M&O. And so when we talk about the fixed costs, right, those are the fixed costs that our school board members have to say, okay, well, we got to pay the air conditioning, we're not getting any money, how are we going to figure out with this? Yeah?
I don't know if I know this, and I'm really actually kind of surprised, but is it for all public education, or is this just for district? I mean, I'm not saying this, I'm just saying Prop 301 in general.
Districts and charters.
It does include charters.
All public education.
All right. Just make sure.
Yeah. So again, cautionary tale. Sometimes things look really good. And again, I think I might have still voted yes on 301, but I would have gotten my fanny in gear to go down and do something about this excess utility things earlier than we did. Because we went down in 2010 and we're like, this is like really bad for us. And it wasn't just really bad for us. We actually it worked out great. We worked with a couple legislators who were like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense at all. We got a new funding formula for utilities. It was going to be great. It passed as a part of the budget. It's never been funded. And that sometimes happens too. Okay, so this is kind of like, I put this on here because people love to throw around numbers. Oh, we give this much to education in the state of Arizona, blah, blah, blah. And this is not an accurate pie chart by any stretch of the imagination. It's just to give you an idea. So this is that base level of support, right? That's what we talk about. Every kid, everywhere gets that from the state, no matter what. Then we add all the weights and the capital funds, you know, largely not interchangeable pots of money, but still calculated into, on average, what every kid in Arizona gets. And then on top of that, you add overrides, bonds, if you've got DSEG dollars, and then you can add federal money is typically Title I and Special Ed. Those are the two big federal programs that bring us money. Title I for children who are living in poverty, Special Ed, self-explanatory. So when people say, oh, we really give like $8,599, $8,599, what they're talking about is if you took all of the money spent in Arizona, divided it by all of the kids in public education, you would come up with that number. Now, if I live in a district where I don't have an override, my number's really not that high, right? If I live in a district where we haven't really built a building anytime recently, my number's really not that high. So this is a pretty fictitious number, right? Because it's a very general average. It does not apply to every kid in the state. This number applies to every single kid in the state. And it's just important when you look at all these like rankings and people saying like this, that, and the other thing, to say, well, what are you including? What are you including in that? Yeah, Lisa.
Well, and I don't want to get you off track here too much, but I think one of the questions you hear all the time is the difference between charter school funding and public school funding. And
Right.
is it safe to say that, so when you go down to base level support, is that in fact the same for district schools
No.
and charter schools?
Yeah, Danny has a point over there.
Yes.
Just get an extra $1,200 a student.
And here's the reason why
Base.
they get an extra
Because they
$1,200
don't
in the
have the
base.
ability.
Because they
They don't have the
cannot,
ability.
they don't have a district to go to, right? They don't have a constituency. So the state has decided, okay, well that's about $1,200. Now we can argue about that, right? We can say like, okay, but what if you're just a district that couldn't pass an override? Like, shouldn't you just get an extra $1,200, right? Because so anyway, so that's why they get that. Charter schools, because they don't have a district to go to, that's just built into their base level funding. Yes.
Just clarifying though, is it correct though that like our PTOs and parent groups and fundraising, we're very limited in how we raise money and how we can contribute that to our school. But charter, their private fundraising can go to things like buildings, unlike ours, right? Like the Dan Trail building and salaries.
Yes,
So they
and they
do
own the
have
building.
access to that money.
And they own the building, right?
Right, and so we might get it through bonds and overrides, but they're able to generate private fundraising
Right.
and use that as they wish, which we're not able to do.
Right, so just to give a teeny tiny background on the history of charter schools. Charter schools were started with a great philosophical concept, I think. And that's my own editorializing, right? But the idea was, let's make a school where we can try out new ideas, right? Let's make a school where we can say, hey, does it work better if you have more administrators or less administrators, or you have like 3 kids in a classroom or 42 kids in a classroom, or so this is the concept of charter schools. Let's make places where we can try new ideas. And so there's a lot fewer restrictions on what they can do because they're supposed to be being all creative and innovative and whatever. The way that has translated over the last 2 decades, though, is essentially that they just get to do stuff that we're not allowed to do. Which, of course, begs the question of, if that was the place where we were supposed to figure out like what works and what doesn't work, and if it works for people to like be able to raise money however they want, and if it works for like a whole lot of administrators to be involved, why aren't we applying all of that to traditional public schools? Because that was the original concept. But that's neither here nor there. That's kind of just the answer to your question shortly is yes. Charter schools can do lots of things that traditional public schools cannot do because they were originally set up to be incubators of new ideas. And so they have fewer restrictions. Okay. So who pays for what? This is where you hear that we're the bottom of the nation, right? We're 49th or 50th. Sometimes we're lucky and we get to 48. But that's where that comes from. Again, $8,599 all in on average for every student. Our state is here now, actually. I just looked it up last night. That's supposed to be $3,116. That was in 2013, which is the lowest. And percentage-wise, right, it's the lowest. Across the nation, most states put in about 45%, right, of all the education. In Arizona, ours was just at 36%. So a third of the money is coming from the state, the bulk of the money is coming from local communities, and some is coming from the federal government. And those numbers are very out of whack with the rest of the nation. That's why we're bottom of the nation, because our state puts in so much less than everybody else.
Wait, can you go back?
Yes.
You get to see the
Yes.
bottom one.
So Arizona system received 49% from local sources. So we now pay locally almost half of all the money. And if you think about the concept of public education, right, this is supposed to be a public good. This is why the state is supposed to manage it. It shouldn't really be up to local communities to be paying the bulk of what's given, especially when that creates the very inequity, right, that the state was supposed to be addressing in 1970 when they had equalization funding, right? Lots of you, I can tell you, I come from Ohio, and in Ohio, everything is local. You live in a great neighborhood, you got an awesome school. You live in a poor neighborhood, you got a bad school, right? And Ohio's in court for exactly the same reason that Arizona was in court in the 1970s. They're like, that's not equitable. That's not public education. That's not what your state constitution tells you you're supposed to be doing. So we've kind of, over time, gotten really out of kilter. I'm not going to go too much into this, like how the state calculates its portion versus ours. They set a qualifying tax rate, and then they say, okay, you have this much property, Scottsdale, and so we're going to tax you this much. And in our particular case, that covers all of our costs of public education. Other places, they're like, well, I only have a little bit of property, and we're gonna tax you this much, and then we're gonna take some money to infuse to get you up to that base level funding, if you can't generate it locally. And it's all very complicated, Mr. O'Brien can tell you all about it. Because this is, I could just get it down on paper and I'm like, okay, I just need to pay my tax bill. So that's kind of this, you know. Smaller rural communities are typically the ones getting state aid to bring them up to that level of every kid's getting the same amount of money. We don't get anything. We generate our own money and we pay for ourselves. So in a nutshell, okay, the state has that equalization funding formula. The most important thing to know about the state of Arizona.
I'm sorry, point of clarification.
Yes.
I just want to go back to that point.
Which point?
City of Scottsdale, SUSD, even though we have some kids from Phoenix.
Right.
All of the money is coming out of our community through our property taxes, et cetera, et cetera. So when someone like a Representative Kavanaugh says, I already give you more for your kid, it's the biggest part of my funding, you know, in the state budget, that is incorrect. He's not actually, we're not getting anything from the general budget for SUSD.
That's correct. Our local tax base pays our base funding.
Right, so we don't get any state aid.
I'm just curious, how come he can keep saying that then?
Well, it's a general statement to the, like, across the state,
Yeah.
public education.
But when he's
spending-
speaking with his
No,
constituents,
that's not true.
who are from Scottsdale,
Right.
Well, and he may be talking about Fountain Hills. He lives in Fountain Hills.
okay,
So maybe he's talking about Fountain Hills,
okay.
but he's not talking about Scottsdale.
gets state aid for,
Yeah, their assessed valuation isn't what they need for their students.
Okay.
And so these are interesting things to know, right? Because who knew that?
Thank you.
Fountain Hills wasn't-
Yes, thank you for that.
Yes. So equalization funding formula, it increases based on weights, and if you have special kids with special needs, and it's not just kids with special needs, it's kids in rural areas, kids far away, you know, little kids, older kids, you know, which of course begs the question why you have a base level funding when, like, you have to give weight to every single kid in the whole state, but that's beside the point. For some projects, we get to vote, right? Overrides, bonds, we get to choose for ourselves locally what do we want to spend our money on, and then state aid, we just don't get it. So this is always kind of interesting for me to see and for you guys to kind of wrap your heads around. When we hear from our legislators, we give you more money as a piece of the pie, right? That's accurate. It is true that spending on public education is a big, maybe the biggest piece of the pie, but it is also true that the pie has shrunk, right? And cuts to public education have been large over the last 5 to 7 years. There we are, right at the top, largest cuts across the state for that 5-year period, 2008, right when Barb got her seat on the board, lucky Barb, was smack in the middle of that, smack in the middle of slash and burn. Just another way to look at it, pretty much everybody agrees. We have cut. Like, there's no way to say, sometimes you hear from our legislators, no, it's not really true that we cut you because we gave you some money here, but pretty much everybody across the board agrees, nope, public education has definitely been cut, maybe by slightly more or less, depending on who you ask. This makes me sad. This makes me really sad. If you look, we used to be ranked 34th in the nation for people spending on education back in 1992. And 34 isn't great, right? But 34, you know, it's all right. It's not bad.
We'd be throwing a party, honey.
We're 34 right now, right? You can see there has been just a systematic decrease in the amount of money compared to other states, right? Because if we go from 34 to 48, I think now we're 49. We might even be 50. Like, everybody else hasn't been doing what we've been doing, or we'd still be 34, right? If everybody else had cut like we had cut because there were recessions and whatnot, we'd still be at 34. We'd still kind of, but we're not. We have made conscious choices to deprioritize funding to education. And I'm going to show you another slide that tells you the same thing. Just so it really sinks into your brain. You know, I don't know what kind of visual people you are, but like arrows, charts, numbers, it all just basically tells you. And if you look over here. In 1964, we gave like more, you know, we were like more than average. We were like over the 25 mark back then because education was important here in the state of Arizona. Okay, if you take away anything from this, forget all the numbers you just saw, forget all the stuff you just heard, know this. If you want to impact education funding in the state of Arizona, you have got to go down to the Capitol. You have got to talk to your legislators You have got to create relationships with them, even the ones you don't like, because they're sitting right now and they're making decisions for you and your children, and they have to hear from you. When you say, has our governor seen this? One of us should take it to them, right? It is incumbent on us, if we want a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, to get our people bodies down there, to say, hey, you guys still work for us, right? And we elected you to represent us. And I tell people this all the time. If you're a Democrat and you have a Republican representative, take your Republican friend. If you don't have one, make one. There's people in this room from both, pick one that you like. If you're a Republican and you have a Democratic representative, because all the ones in 24, get your best Democrat friend and go down there. You know, these folks, they represent all of you, but you didn't vote them into office. So get a buddy and go down there. It's good anyways to be bipartisan, right? That's model behavior for our legislators, for us to go down with somebody in the opposite party and say, we actually agree on this subject. There are times where we're not going to agree, but there are times that we are going to agree. And education is a great time for us all to agree. Yes, and the only other thing I'm going to say, which is not on here, and this applies to every elected official, and I have learned this lesson the hard way. Remember that your elected officials are people. They have families, they have friends, believe it or not, and they are doing a service to our community. So no matter how torqued you are, be calm and be nice, especially to your school board members because they take the brunt. And it's true. And you're allowed to be poignant, but you're not allowed to be nasty. You know what? Because when you're nasty to elected officials, guess what happens? No good people run for office because they're like, who the heck needs that in their life, right?
Right.
I speak from experience. Be nice to people running for office because they are doing a hard job that a lot of people don't want to do. And we need good, kind, compassionate people to want to run for office. So be nice to them. Even the ones you don't agree one little bit on. You can look at it and say, I don't agree one little bit with you, but I appreciate the fact that you're serving and that you took the time to listen to me. And then you move on to the next one. All right? Questions? I put you all to sleep. All right. Awesome. Thank you. And again, this is the background that you will need.